Incoming message.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're looking at something absolutely wild. The theological nature of UAPs, and specifically, why brief the pastors first. Let's just jump right in. Right before the government released its highly anticipated fourth batch of UAP files back in July 2026, they basically threw standard protocol completely out the window. I mean, instead of heading straight to scientific labs like you'd expect, they went somewhere totally unprecedented, and it set the stage for a massive anomaly. Let's get right into the facts of what actually happened. So why did the government brief pastors first? This question right here sits at the very center of today's explainer. Because before the Pentagon released its latest files to the public, there were these highly secretive private meetings taking place. But here's the kicker. They didn't invite the scientific community. No. Instead, U.S. government contractors held these clandestine meetings exclusively with evangelical Christian pastors. I mean, really think about that for a second. The government is gearing up to release classified files about unidentified anomalous phenomena, and the very first civilian group they decide to bring into the loop is religious leadership. Okay, let's dive into this because the contrast is just glaring. Normally, when you're dealing with non-human intelligence, you would absolutely expect the government to brief physicists to try and reverse engineer the tech, right? Or maybe psychologists to manage the public reaction, or sociologists to gauge the cultural impact. But they bypassed those secular experts entirely. They went straight to evangelical pastors. The implicit message here is frankly staggering. It tells us that whatever information was coming down the pipeline, it was going to require a theological framework, not just a scientific one. To really grasp why this matters, we have to look at how these disclosures have escalated over time. It's like a staircase. We started out at step 1, with historical files and anomalies. Then, step 2, we got hard radar data, undeniable technological tracking of these phenomena. But then, things shifted gears dramatically. Step 3 saw information reaching the Catholic Church. And finally, step 4, direct private briefings with evangelical leadership just before the most recent data drop. We literally moved from historical curiosities straight into the highest levels of global religious consciousness. So, what exactly prompted that massive escalation? Well, look at the July 10, 2026 fourth batch release. We're talking 162 total files here, including 40 documents, 19 videos, and 4 audio recordings. But honestly, it wasn't the quantity of the data that mattered. It was the content itself. You see, the previous releases heavily focused on the objects, those metallic crafts flying through our skies. This batch, however, fundamentally shifted the focus away from the crafts and directly onto whatever was inside, near, or associated with them. And that shift from the ships to the entities themselves is exactly why those private meetings went down. Let's lay out the verified facts to build this picture. First off, these briefings were actually held by government contractors, not official Pentagon personnel. The New York Times independently confirmed these meetings took place on May 31, 2026. And what happened inside that room? Well, the pastors were shown classified photographs. Intelligence community insiders explicitly told the church to prepare for disclosure. They were instructed to prepare their congregations, but, and this is a big but, they were firmly asked not to speculate publicly about the specific contents of those photographs. But as you can probably guess, despite that request to keep things quiet, hints definitely made their way to the public. Just 2 days before the fourth batch was officially released, Pastor Joseph Z., who had actually attended one of these briefings, went on national television. On July 8, 2026, on NewsNation, he dropped this incredibly ominous quote. He confirmed they were indeed dealing with non-human intelligence, but it was his follow-up that caught everyone's attention. He said, "They don't look like what you expect." That is a massive clue. Because if they don't look like the classic gray aliens or the little green men of pop culture, what exactly was in those government photographs? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is what researchers found when they started scouring that fourth batch of data. One specific descriptor kept appearing over and over again: translucent. They weren't describing a solid biological form. They weren't describing a metallic drone or a gray alien silhouette. These files described encounters with entities that were partially or fully light permeable. Think about that. When a pastor looks at a classified government photograph and sees something translucent, you really have to ask yourself, are we talking translucent like glass, or are we talking translucent like pure light? Okay, so how do we bridge that incredibly bizarre description with actual hard science? Well, we can look to quantum physics, specifically a state of matter known as a Bose-Einstein condensate. This is a quantum state where, at certain energy levels, particles actually lose their individual identities and essentially become transparent. The theory here is wild for sure, but it is grounded in science. A being existing at a higher energy state than our standard biological matter would appear entirely translucent to human observers because we're operating at a lower, denser energy frequency. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate resolution to our central mystery. Why do they choose the pastors? Because while secular science really struggles to categorize a translucent, high-energy entity, ancient religions absolutely do not. Look across Abrahamic texts. Christianity has angels, seraphim, and the Transfiguration. Islam has the concept of Nur, which literally describes beings of pure light. Judaism has the Merkabah tradition, detailing divine radiant forms. The government didn't choose faith leaders for a quick photo op. They chose them because these ancient texts already possess a highly developed classification system for radiant, non-human intelligence. So we are looking at a literal theological collision here. Impartially reviewing the source data, it's clear this was absolutely not just some government PR stunt designed to calm the public. The real issue is that a purely secular scientific framework just lacks the vocabulary for this. The brief leaders, on the other hand, already possess a working theological model for this exact phenomenon. The truly fascinating takeaway for us is that by releasing files on translucent entities, the government isn't just preparing people for extraterrestrial contact. They might inadvertently be utilizing and perhaps even confirming descriptions found in 2,000-year-old religious texts to categorize modern anomalies. Actually, scratch that. There is a slightly darker, way more pragmatic angle to this that we have to consider. Shortly after the briefings, Bishop Alan Didio publicly stated, "To focus on Christian leaders specifically is suspicious. I'm not sure what it means, but Christians are probably one of the few groups that wouldn't completely fall apart." That is a chilling observation. It reveals a major strategic realization. Choosing faith leaders wasn't some nice compliment about their theology. It was a cold, strategic calculation by the intelligence community about psychological resilience. They desperately needed a demographic whose entire worldview wouldn't just shatter upon seeing those photographs. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought. The fourth batch is out there. The translucent entities are officially on the record. The strategic calculation to brief the people least likely to suffer a psychological collapse has already been executed. But disclosure isn't a one-and-done event. It's an ongoing process. If the government's primary concern was finding a group that could just absorb this specific, mind-bending information and keep functioning, what on earth does that imply about the severity of the information that is still coming next? Thanks so much for joining me for this.
Come to me, chickens! Cock-a-doodle-doo!